Right, well, I'm delighted to be with you. I'm rather sorry that I can't be with you in person. I think it would be rather nicer to be in India under different circumstances, but circumstances are as they are, and they apply very specifically to what I want to talk about today in terms of fear, risk, and security. I'm not an expert on risk analysis. I started as a criminologist and I moved into particularly focusing on tourism some 20 years ago when I really forward planned towards retirement. I decided that rather than being a criminologist fading away into oblivion, I'd like to shift from being a criminologist who went on holiday a lot to being a criminologist who specialised in tourism. And so I started getting more interested in tourism and the sort of issues that are raised in tourism. Now, I appreciate that some of that will be of more interest to some of you and less interest to others of you, but I hope that the things that I'm talking about today will have some relevance to most people here. I want to particularly focus on two pieces of research that I've been involved in. I'm going to mention a couple more along the way, but the two pieces of research specifically are a study we're doing at the moment using crowdsourcing Mechanical Turk to get a sample of people in specifically America and Britain and their views on risk, harm, threats in choosing to take holidays in the next few years. And a study that we finished fairly recently, which is a case study of the 2015 terrorist attack on the Rue Imperial Mahaba Hotel in Sousse, Tunisia, where 38 tourists were actually killed during that attack. So, let me start with the concept of risk. We live in a risk society, as Beck said way back in 1992, and that's never been more evident than during the current COVID-19 pandemic. Beck said risks are lurking everywhere, and they're threats posed by not just health issues like COVID-19, but by extreme weather, natural disasters, political instability, crime and terrorism. As a consequence, Beck argued, fear determines the attitudes towards life. Security is replacing freedom and equality from the highest position on the scale of values. However, as Beck himself acknowledged, some risks are considered acceptable. We may, as rational actors, deploy cost-benefit analysis in considering that the benefits to be derived from certain choices outweigh the risks. At the moment, for example, we have lots of British tourists desperately wanting to go abroad on holidays, even to places that have relatively high risks from COVID-19, because they consider, whether they're rational actors or not, I doubt, but they consider that the benefits of going abroad on holiday outweigh the costs, the risks of catching COVID-19. Additionally, though, risk is situationally and temporally located. The chance of being attacked outside a bar at night is greater than that of being attacked on a suburban street in daylight. And citizens perceive dangers to be greater after dark than during the daytime. And that's well researched by criminologists. However, there's a notable lack of criminological research on fear and risk among tourists. As I said then, I want to focus on tourists and look at these two pieces of research that we've been doing recently. firstly and ongoing, so none of this is actually printed up and published yet, it's literally coming off the press. But we've been asking in the current situation what people think about the threats, the dangers, the risk of going on holiday during the next few years. And we've looked at that particularly in the context of threats through political violence and public disorder, through crime and through health-related risks. And at the moment we focused on American tourists and British tourists. And perhaps I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with working with crowdsourcing platforms. It's something that I've only started doing recently. Until then, I was much more committed to using carrier pigeons for getting basic information across to people. But I've been dragged into the 21st century by my younger colleagues. These platforms do, however, allow us to get to a large proportion of people, particularly in countries like America and India, which is a popular user of Mechanical Turk. But it's something that you can do relatively cheaply and also relatively quickly. Our survey was something like 5 or 6 minutes, and we posted it to try and get a sample of over 600 citizens from America. We posted it one day a couple of weeks ago, and we actually had 800 responses within between 3 and 4 hours. So it has a considerable advantage in that it allows you to be really up to date with the issues that are a concern to people. And while we'd originally seen this research as focusing on crime and terrorist incidents, we adapted it at the last minute to look at health-related issues given the situation with COVID-19. So what we've got there is some indications, as I say, this is very much hot off the press, but some indications that in deciding on which places in the world it's safe to go to or risky to go to, where people would consider going on holiday within the next few years, we get a fairly clear pattern, and people making quite clear distinctions between different countries' risk and different countries' risk in the context of different sorts of problem. That said, we do find that there are some general patterns in that some countries are seen as almost no-go countries. I should say we didn't include all countries in the world, that would have been impossible, but we did focus on countries which American and British tourists would tend to go to on holiday. So we didn't, for example, include, as some tourism researchers have done, high-risk countries like the Yemen or Iraq or wherever. So we were talking about countries that American and British people would possibly be considering as a location for a holiday. Let me just share a couple of early findings with you before I go on to the second piece of research that we've been involved in. Firstly, as far as Americans were concerned, there are actually 3 countries in the world that Americans felt were high risk across the board, that they felt that problems of political unrest or terrorism, problems of crime and problems with health issues were such that they would not really want to travel there on holiday over the next few years. And they were Mexico, certainly as far as crime is concerned, Mexico has a problem with a high crime rate and was seen as a no-go area by a high proportion of Americans. China, and of course we've seen the situation in China with Trump heralding the fact that China is the great menace. And so, whereas in fact, all the evidence we've got would suggest that crime isn't a particular problem in China, the Americans who replied to our survey saw crime not quite alongside, but fairly high, alongside terrorism and political unrest and health issues. Well, health issues is fairly obvious in terms of COVID-19, but political unrest and terrorism, maybe they're thinking of the situation in certain parts of China. Hong Kong may come into the equation here, but certainly as far as the tourism industry in China is concerned, it would look as though they're going to take a big hit as far as potential American tourists are concerned. And I've left the best till last. The third country that Americans feel very dubious about going on holiday to for those three reasons is the United States. Yep. Most countries in the world were seen as safer than the United States to American citizens. Again, of course, we've seen with COVID-19 that it is out of control in America and very high rates of infection. Crime in America is problematic, and I think that's fairly obvious. Terrorism and political unrest, maybe in the context of George Forbes and the Black Lives Matter movement, it's political unrest on that level that people are talking about. But they stood out. The survey for British citizens is a bit further back in line, but we do have some preliminary findings. And as far as a British market is concerned, some of the places that British tourists have tended to go to in the past really were distinct from American potential tourists. Again, America stood out as a country that across the board British tourists felt was a high-risk place to choose to go on holiday. But particularly as far as terrorist and political dissent is concerned, three countries showed up to probably a greater extent for Europeans than for Americans, and they were Turkey, Tunisia, and Egypt. All countries where there have been examples of terrorist incidents in the last few years, and which appear to resonate far more with a British market than with an American market. That brings me on to my second example, because Tunisia is a country that we looked at in a little more detail in relation to the 2015 terrorist incident where 38 people were killed, mostly British tourists. And what we've done here is to take this particular incident as a case study looking at risk security management. I should stress that I am no expert in risk security management, but I want to use this example to take us a little bit further along, generalizing from this to tourism and risk and safety. So when we looked at security management in the context of the particular incident in Sousse, it seemed that three different levels were of particular importance. Firstly, there's the question of which countries or places within countries are dangerous, more risky, places that maybe should come with a good government health warning. The second area is to do with security within a resort or within a hotel complex or whatever. In other words, what does a tourist resort do to minimize risks? Now, we were particularly interested in crime and terrorism, but of course, you will be much more expert than me in generalizing that to other sorts of risks. And the third area is to do with reaction to a crisis. What do the authorities do? What measures have they got in place to deal with a crisis when it actually occurs? And we took, as I said, the Tunisian example as a case study, partly because there's a lot of information available in the public domain because of the inquiry subsequently held in Tunisia and an inquest held in Britain looking at the various issues. And if we take those three levels, firstly, where is it dangerous? Which areas are at risk of various dangers? And what is done to make people aware of that? And what we found in the context of the Sousse attack was that the tour operator, because on that level it was very clearly the tour operator who was responsible for making tourists aware of what were safer or more dangerous places to go to, but the tour operator generally minimized the fact that there was a particular risk of terrorist incidents occurring in Tunisia. So people who booked holidays in Tunisia weren't told about the fact that there have been incidents within the last 2 or 3 years. Secondly, what does the resort area, the hotel, do about it in terms of minimizing risk? What sort of risk assessment is in place? And in the context of the hotel in Tunisia, we might be asking questions about a risk assessment document. Well, there was one. It mentioned all sorts of things, but it didn't actually talk about terrorist incidents. So on that level, there was a total failure. But we might be thinking about how do you minimize risk through, for example, policing. And that might involve the public police, but also private security within the hotel. And in terms of issues surrounding crime prevention through environmental design. And again, as I said, with no risk assessment, specifically looking at the possibility of a terrorist incident, the policing side was very lax. For example, the hotel were reluctant to allow any staff, security staff, to have arms because they felt that this gave the wrong image to the tourist industry. But also in terms of crime prevention through environmental design, there was no sort of planning or awareness of what the danger points were, what the weaknesses were in terms of someone coming in from outside. And the third issue is to do with responding to an emergency. The emphasis here is on perhaps private security, but to a greater extent perhaps on the public police, and perhaps more so than is warranted. The two post-event inquiries put a lot of emphasis on the inadequacies of the police in dealing with the situation. maybe that's part of the looking for scapegoats phenomena, but most witnesses were highly critical of the inadequacies of the police. Now that may be, as in the case of the feedback to the inquiries, looking at a personal issue, the inadequacies of the particular police officers and the way they responded or didn't respond to the situation. But it's also involved with things like interagency cooperation, networks of communication between private security and the public police, and the way the public police are organised in terms of being able to respond to an emergency quickly. Let me take that case study, just to finish, slightly further and say, in terms of these three dimensions to risk assessment, what do we know from the wider tourist literature and what we've been doing in our research that we can apply to these three different levels? Firstly, in terms of giving information on where is safe, where isn't safe, where risks are higher than others. Clearly, it's in the interest of the tourism industry to sell resorts, to sell regions, to minimise the negative aspects of which security and risk are important elements. But basic things like providing tourists with information on how to behave safely while they're there, what the particular dangers are, those are important, and those have been taken on board, I think, in a lot of crime prevention initiatives in tourist areas. One other point, though, I'd like to make when we look at the dangerous element of particular resorts, and it's a piece of research that we're also carrying out. In the last couple of years, TripAdvisor has been pressured to including on its website and its webpage for different resorts feedback from tourists where they're talking about dangerous situations and the fact that there's a risk of particular crimes, or they experience particular crimes while staying at hotels. And that's something we're looking at in terms of analysing the information that's there on TripAdvisor and looking at how that is related to the to different types of hotel within an area and within a country. The second point, what does the resort, the area, the hotel do to minimise risk? What sort of risk assessment is carried out, etc. And I've already talked about policing. Policing might be private policing, private security, but it might be the public police as well. And communication and interagency working is a very important aspect of that. But it's also to do with crime prevention through environmental design. Ensuring that things like not only access points but lighting outside the hotel, etc., are up to standard. Another piece of work which I've not been involved in, but I'm just citing on hotels in America, suggested that hotels where that were located in higher crime areas, so it's not just within the hotel, it's around the hotel as well, tended to be less profitable than those that were located in low crime areas. And I think that's an indication of the extent to which, despite a gut reaction that hiding away your problems is one way of encouraging tourists, that in fact, if you're seen to be a secure and have a secure environment, that will actually boost profits. Another point, though, about the security of the resort or the hotel that really hasn't been taken on board by earlier research, and which we're covering in another crowdsourcing survey that we've been doing, is to challenge the assumption that security is to do with perimeter security, but crime is committed by outsiders. Now that's relevant in the context of the TripAdvisor point that I was just making, in that where the high-profile cases that have made the international press to do with dangers within hotels and complexes have focused not on the fact that it's outsiders committing the crimes, but that it's people within the resort or within the hotel that are committing the offences, staff or fellow guests. And the tourism literature generally hasn't taken this on board. There's been the assumption that crime is committed by outsiders rather than people within. There's one particular piece of research in the Caribbean, for example, that suggests that Americans feel safer than and are safer than British tourists going to the Caribbean because they generally stay in all-inclusive hotels, whereas the British are less likely to go for the all-inclusive option. And therefore, within the all-inclusive hotel, there's security and greater safety. But that's assuming that hotels have done their job appropriately in terms of vetting staff, and it's assuming that crimes aren't committed by other tourists. And that's something we're questioning at the moment. We don't have the answers, but we're working on the assumption that people may feel safe within the secure bubble of the tourist resort, or the all-inclusive hotel, but that may be a false safety because of the problems from other people who are within that bubble. The third point, what measures are in place to respond to an emergency? I talked about, in the context of Seuss, the police response to the emergency. Of course, most emergencies aren't major emergencies like a terrorist attack with a lot of deaths. What's an emergency to a guest of the hotel may be the fact that they've been robbed. It's not something that's going to dramatically transform the situation in the hotel, but it has a major impact on that one person or family. And the way in which local services and the industry is geared towards dealing with people who suffer problems on holiday is particularly important. And that may mean in certain parts of the world that we have specialist tourist police. They developed in America, but they've been very common in Asia. Specialist tourist police dealing with the problems that tourists face. It may mean specialist tourist victim support services. Ironically, actually, the most developed of those in the world comes from the Republic of Ireland, where as part of victim services, they have a separate organisation responding to tourist problems. And perhaps that brings me to my last point. What they found in the Republic of Ireland was that people who'd experienced crime clearly found that a distressing event. Going back to what I was saying earlier about people choosing to avoid particular places for holiday because they're seen as high risk, you might therefore say people who've been victims of crime on holiday will avoid going back to those places because they're seen as more dangerous. That's not necessarily the case, but in the particular example of the Republic of Ireland, what the feedback suggests is that people who went to tourist victim support for help, actually the benefits they gained from that were that they appreciated the help they got, the support they got. Their vision of Ireland was changed from a negative one, I was the victim of crime, to a positive one, and lots of people helped me. And I think that's the important message for security everywhere. Security is in the interest not only of in terms of versus profitability, but security can actually improve profitability. I hope that's given you some causes for thought, and I haven't bored you for too long. Thank you.